Hi guys, Ronnie here and welcome to the workshop. Today I want to talk about a topic that I get asked a lot about, and that's just simply how to make your bike faster. And I've seen many people do this completely wrong and go for upgrades in a completely wrong order. And because I'm often getting called a snob and an elitist these days by some jealous folks, I will start from the most basic and most budget-friendly options that you can really do to your bike setup and will actually make it faster. And in order to do that, and in order to make any kind of improvements, the first thing you need to do is to understand what forces are holding you back when you are riding your bike out on the road or gravel, dirt, mountain bike trail, whatever might that be. So if you talk about road cycling as the general point of view, then the whole resisting force equation can be brought down to a couple of main factors. First of them, and by far the biggest, is aerodynamic drag. Now this is done and created when you try to ride through atmospheric air, and the molecules that you push around you essentially slow you down. You create a low pressure wake behind you, and that's limiting your progress because it creates a suction force that's holding you back. So that's basically the primary school explanation that I can give you. So usually in most cases this is the biggest portion of the drag that you're experiencing on the bike, and it's not what I'm going to focus on today, because firstly, reducing your drag apart from the position, first position, it's a very complex topic, can be hard and expensive and to dial in, and it's very personal, so it doesn't really apply to this video. Secondly, by using equipment to reduce your drag also is quite specific to the rider and has to be tested, and thus becomes expensive and hard to elaborate. So that leads me on to the second part of the equation, and that's rolling resistance. Now, rolling resistance essentially is created by two main contributors. So the first one is the actual hysteretic loss. This is created when the tire that you force to roll onto the road by your own propulsion force is being deformed at the contact patch. And this happens cyclically as the wheel revolves as you ride along. So that's the first thing. And the second part of rolling resistance, and the one that is it's becoming more and more to the forefront these days, and that's the impedance loss or the suspension losses. These are created when you have an uneven surface with some imperfections, and when you ride over this uneven surface with a very stiff tire, then this is not able to absorb that imperfection, and it causes the whole system of you and the bike to lift up by the margin on the height of this imperfection, and this essentially takes energy from your kinetic energy. And since you have to move the whole system up, it transforms that kinetic energy to potential energy as your height increases relative to the ground level. Even if it's just by a couple of millimeters, it sucks away that speed, that kinetic energy that you have built up. Essentially, it's like when you imagine that you go on a pair of roller skates on a really rough surface, you come to a stop almost immediately, and this is just because the solid tires of the roller skates can't absorb those impacts and imperfections. So this is one thing, and The reason I really want to focus on reducing rolling resistance here, because no matter the speed, no matter the gradient, no matter the terrain, it's always a factor. It's the same for everyone. It's very linear, very easy to calculate, and of course the main part of rolling resistance, or the main part that affects it, are the tires, the tubes, the sealant, well, basically the system around your wheel. And the data on that is very clear, very straightforward. It's actually widely available for free. It's public data that is available from many sources, for example AirCoach, bicycleresistance.com, Wheel Energy, Silverstone Sports, Engineering Hub, etc. There are various sources, independent. It's a well-tested topic and it just works. And the good thing about that is, if you take the tires and the ones that are available on the market right now, there are really just a handful of market leaders that perform well above the others, and everything else is basically stuff that you don't need to take care about. So in the description down below I will link at the sites where you can find these results and the best performing tires. That's a very handy tool to have. So this is basically the part that covers the hysteretic losses. And the second part is actually adjusting the correct pressure. Now this is completely free, and again there are many great calculators online that you can use for free and will give you a rough idea of where to start. One important thing about tire pressure is that it's not a metric that you try to maximize or minimize. There's really just an optimum, and if you go above that it's worse, and if you go below that it's worse than optimal. So that makes it a bit tricky, but can be done. And one thing to note there is it's better always to err on the low side than on the high side, because the penalty and the breakaway point is bigger towards the upside. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now if you look at the data, I don't know when this video will be watched, so because there are new tires coming to the market all the time and they're getting better and better. At the current state of the market, really there are just a couple of tires for road use that I would recommend or identify as the market leaders. If you talk about tubeless tires, then it's GP5000 STR Continental, which incidentally is the one I have on my bike right now. Then if you talk about, a good alternative to this is the Michelin Power Road TLR, which is basically exactly the same in terms of performance, but has wider availability, and we have it in stock in the shop right now, so I'll link that down below just as well. So these are the two tubeless tire options. For the clinchers, for racing, I really wouldn't go much further than the S-Works Turbo Cotton or the regular GP5000 Conti Clincher. Again, these are both in stock. Essentially our shop only stocks these kinds of products that are proven to be fast. That's what I made my business on, and that's what the promise that I give to my customers, to make these choices for them. And then in a clincher tire, pairing it with a inner tube is also very important, because regular butyl tubes are, well, they hold air well. Nowadays they're also relatively puncture resistant, but they're slow because butyl has a high hysteretic loss. Unlike latex, which is what I recommend using. Now I generally recommend challenge latex tubes because these are seamless, so they're made in one piece, which takes away the problem that you usually get with bonds in these kind of inner tubes, and they just work fine. They're pretty puncture resistant. The downside is that you do have to keep an eye on the pressures, because they lose pressure overnight, so you need to top them up before every ride, should I say. There's one more option these days, and they are all kinds of TPU, thermoplastic polyurethane tubes, like the Pirelli Smart Tube or the Schwalbe Aerothan, etc., Revolup and Tubelito, etc. These are fine, they're light, and that's about it. And they're very puncture resistant usually and hold the air extremely long. The downside of this, again, these thermoplastic materials are quite tough. They have a high hysteretic loss, so they're not as fast as latex. And yes, you do save a bit of weight, but that weight difference will never ever offset the difference in rolling resistance, which is important to keep in mind. Because some people tend to go for weight, but weight just doesn't really matter all that much. Certainly not when you talk about these margins. So if you compare that, you save 100 grams on a tire, you need to remember, or tubes, you need to remember that the whole system, well, I'm a pretty light rider, but I weigh 60,000 grams and my bike weighs 8,000 grams, 9,000 with 2 full water bottles maybe, so that's 69,000 grams of total system weight, maybe 70,000 if you add a helmet, shoes, etc. And you're saving 50 or 100 grams of that. Does it sound significant? No, it's not. And it will not make a difference. But if you save 10% of rolling resistance, then that's 10%, not 0.1%. So this is what you need to understand. But anyway, that's enough rambling on about rolling resistance, I think. This is basically what you need to know, and how can you make educated guesses in this area. Again, I have mentioned some specific products, but this will change over time, and I change these recommendations over time as I follow along on what's happening on the market. So yeah, my first budget upgrade recommendation: check your rolling resistance, your tire and tube choices, and your pressures. So crucially, very important, and cheap, because in the grand scheme of things, if you factor in the cost of the bike, etc., upgrading a tires is no big deal. And usually stock bikes do come with pretty bad tires. And again, I will say, there's an amazing number of riders that I see riding around in races and triathlons, etc., that have very suboptimal tire choices, particularly here in Slovakia, Czech Republic, where these pretty crappy Tufo tubulars and things like that are still very popular. So yeah, keep an eye on rolling resistance. The second thing, and it's also one that I ramble on quite a lot about, is drivetrain losses. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the little details here, because really at some point when it comes to drivetrain losses, you do start to get diminishing returns. So bigger chain rings, specially coated chain rings, oversized pulley wheel systems, ceramic bearings, etc. These are tangible, or I wouldn't say tangible, but measurable upgrades, but they're expensive and they don't save that much. What does save a huge amount though is, firstly, which chain you use and how do you lubricate it. Well, actually the chain choice itself pretty limited by the group set. There are some options usually, but there are some chains better than others in this regard. Usually this is in the region of 2 to 3 watts of a difference at an output of 250 watts. Again, these differences are linear, so you also need to keep in mind that with drivetrain losses, or actually it's slightly above linear. So if you talk about 2 watts lost at 250, it may be 5-6 watts at 500. Why does it matter? Because you don't really ride all that much at 500 watts. But when you do, it's usually in a critical point when there's an attack in the race, when you need to hang on, and that's when it's going to matter the most. So that's the most crucial thing, and why you need to keep an eye on this. Again, at 1000 watts, that may be 15 watts saved. So that can be a difference between a bike length in a sprint. and of course deriving from that a victory and a loss, or a victory and fourth place. So that's why drivetrain loss. And again, just like rolling resistance, it's always there. As long as you're pedaling, if it's uphill, if it's downhill, or on the flat, whatever power output you're putting out, there's always some drivetrain loss. And if you do some work to cut it, it's going to benefit your overall efficiency tremendously. Not to mention, if you cut friction, you also cut wear from your components. So in the long run, you do save a significant amount of money by just not wearing out your components that regularly. So let's start with the example that is basically the first and obvious choice, and that's chain lubrication. Now, if you watch this channel and you've been around for a while, then you know that I'm a big proponent of waxing your chain, if it's fully immersive waxing or drip waxing. Nowadays the drip waxes are also pretty damn good, and they can be used nicely to complement the immersive waxing strategy. So the advantages are reduced drivetrain friction by a lot, then the fact that your chain remains almost completely clean, it doesn't attract dirt, and as I mentioned a couple of moments ago, is the reduced wear that you experience on your components. So if you take a really nasty drivetrain, oily, gunky, grimy, this can suck away 20 to 30 watts even at a small output of 250. And if you upgrade this to a really nicely cleaned and waxed chain, this can go down to as much as 3 or 4 watts of loss. So that's a huge difference. And again, I will repeat that you're not wearing out your stuff. So just like with the rolling resistance, data on drivetrain friction is also pretty widely available. It's not as straightforward to get to, but there are sites, for example, Zero Friction Cycling might be the market leader in this by a long stretch, and I totally recommend checking out their data because they test all kinds of stuff. And really, again, my recommendations here are really just some of the top performing products. So if you talk about immersive waxing, then it has to be the Silca Hot Melt Wax and the new formula of the Molten Speed Wax. Now, Molten is the product that I started using from the get-go. It's basically the OG chain wax, and it's pretty damn great. And now it has an updated formula for even lower friction and longer lifespan. So it's a great product. Again, both of these will be linked down below to our shop where you can get these. And for the drip loops, the two leaders that I would recommend are again from Silca, the Super Secret Chain Lube and the Ceramic Speed UFO Drip. Again, these are very similarly priced and products, and they perform very similarly, which means at an extremely high standard. So I can recommend both of these. These will make your drivetrain last a lot longer and be a lot faster. The downsides to chain waxing, there are two, I think. One of them is more of a myth, and that it takes a lot of time and effort to create and rewax your chain. This is just not true. Yes, you do have to make an initial investment of stripping your chain, preferably a new one, to strip it of all factory grease and put it down to the bare metal and then wax it. But if you've done this once, then all you need to do is to reapply wax again. And even if you talk about immersive waxing, all you really need to do is to take the chain off your bike, thread it onto a piece of wire and immerse it for a couple of minutes in the wax chain, which is a completely passive process. You can do different things around that in the meantime, so it doesn't really take much. And we have these very cool new products that are drip boxes, and you can just substitute this process with those, so really it's not an issue. Removing the factory grease can be a bit of a problem sometimes, but for this we have the solution, because we have pre-prepped chains of different kinds, again in the store, will be linked down below, and you can get those and just keep on waxing happily with the products I've just mentioned. So that's one thing, bit of a myth. Really, the second thing that people tend to notice, and this is a real thing, is noise. Chain wax is solid when it's applied to the chain, so there is no liquid to suck up the noise from the drivetrain. This also means that it doesn't suck energy, because the noise you create, and if you dampen it, that's energy lost. So here it's not dampened, so more of it goes through actual propulsion, but you can hear the chain. It can be noisier, and it usually is a lot noisier than an oiled chain. Now, previously I was running 11-speed race Di2 on the chain on my road bike, and that's a pretty noisy drivetrain if you compare them. This 12-speed one is a bit more quiet, but you can still hear that. So if you want a perfectly silent bike and you don't care about anything else, then maybe chain waxing is not for you. But if you're in for performance, longevity, then it definitely is. Another thing that comes to mind regarding this is wet weather performance. Now, since the wax is solid, it's flaking off, so it's not covering 100% of your chain 100% of the time. So if you come from a wet ride, it might not give enough corrosion protection, so you need to dry it off ideally, because it can start to corrode. Performance wise, the wax locked in the rollers usually takes a really long time, even in the wet, to wear out. So overall the friction will still be a lot lower than with an oil chain, plus it won't attract as much dirt, which grinds away the metal between the plates, so it will last longer, but you need to keep in mind it doesn't give that much corrosion protection. That's really a very small downside to it in the grand scheme of things. Okay, so that's pretty much it regarding saving watts with reducing drivetrain friction. If you talk about the costs of this, again, choosing a higher end chain lubricant like this might seem like an investment in first, but really it's not that much of a deal, because, for example, this bag of silica costs around 50 something euros, and it will easily last you at least a season, but more likely 2. So if you spread it out, it's nothing really, particularly considering that all those stupid oils from Makov, etc., all this bullshit that they try to sell, how much do they cost and last? It's nothing really. And then of course you need to factor in the running costs of the drivetrain, because, well, I can speak from my own experience. I ride in pretty much all conditions. I don't really ride indoors these days anymore, and even like that, chains do last upwards of 6 to almost 8,000 kilometers, when I was getting around 1,000 with an oil chain. So that's a huge difference. And not to mention the cassettes and the chain rings. So the cassettes I had on for 11 speed, I actually never wore one out, even though I ride quite a lot. Same for the chain rings and the rest of the drivetrain. So in fact, if I think about it, I never had to change any of those due to wear. So that's a big deal, I think. So actually this doesn't really cost anything, so that's the great thing about it. Actually it's a cost saving and a watt saving, so, and it's also convenient because you don't mess up your stuff with all this gunk and oil and black grimy shit. So yeah, it's great. It's a great thing all around, and I don't have a single customer probably that I've converted to a chain wax and then he would go back to oil. I can't really recall anyone. So I think that's just a testament of how well this works and why you should definitely use it. So yeah, I think that would sum it up nicely. Now, this might have been quite a lot of information if it's just 2 topics. So if you're not quite sure about what to choose for your riding, then of course you can feel free to book my consultation service, which will be linked down below. And if you like to see more about this and go into it in depth, then let me know what you'd like to see in separate videos. I already do have a very detailed video about chain waxing itself, so how do you need to do it. So if you're interested in that, I will also link that in the description. So that will be a lot of links in the description, but all useful stuff, I believe. So yeah, that probably concludes it for today. Thank you for watching and see you next time.